Ever get that feeling, like things aren't what they seem, like there's stuff going on behind the curtain we're not quite seeing?
Oh, absolutely. That feeling that maybe, just maybe, some things are intentionally hidden.
Right. Well, today we're diving into one of those what-if scenarios. We're talking tax-exempt foundations, those big charitable organizations, and their potential influence in the U.S.
And not just a general overview, we're going deep, using a 1982 interview with a former congressional investigator named Norman Dodd as our guide.
And let me tell you, this guy, Norman Dodd, he didn't just investigate these foundations. He walked away with a whole theory about their impact on American life, especially, he says, on education.
It's some pretty eyebrow-raising stuff. Claims about hidden agendas, manipulation, even attempts to undermine American values.
Exactly. But don't worry, we're not just going to take his word for it. We're approaching this with our critical thinking caps on, ready to sift through the claims and see what holds water.
It's a fascinating deep dive because it requires us to understand the context of the time. We're talking about the 1950s here, the height of the Cold War, when anxieties about communism were running high.
Right, you couldn't turn on the radio without hearing about the Red Scare. And that's where Norman Dodd enters the picture. But hold on, this wasn't just some guy with an opinion. Dodd had serious credentials.
Oh yeah, he was the real deal. In 1954, Dodd served as the research director for a congressional committee called the Reese Committee, specifically tasked with investigating whether these tax-exempt foundations were involved in any un-American activities, and they weren't messing around with that term.
Un-American, back then, had a very specific legal meaning. Trying to change the U.S. government through unconstitutional means. We're talking potential subversion here, not just disagreeing with the government.
Exactly. So the Reese Committee, they weren't just looking for folks with different opinions. They were looking for evidence of a deliberate effort to undermine the U.S. government.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So we've got Dodd, this official investigator, digging into these foundations. But here's the thing. His story starts way before the Reese Committee, back when he was a young guy working in banking.
And not just any time in banking. We're talking the Roaring '20s, followed by the devastating crash of '29. Talk about a crash course in the fragility of the financial system.
You can imagine the impact that had on him, right?
Yeah.
Seeing the economy collapse firsthand, it lit a fire in him to understand how it all worked, how such a massive failure could happen. He wanted to prevent it from happening again.
He became obsessed with the idea of sound banking practices, basically transparency and accountability.
Right.
He spent years, literally years, studying the financial system, trying to figure out how to make it more stable, more resilient.
Seems reasonable, right? Learn from the mistakes of the past. But get this, Dodd presents his findings to these big-shot bank executives, his own superiors, and they basically shrug him off.
They told him straight up that sound banking, as he called it, was a thing of the past.
Gone, obsolete.
And the reason they gave: the institutionalization of conflicting interests. They believed these conflicts had become so deeply embedded in every level of society, including the financial system, that real reform was practically impossible.
That's when those alarm bells really started going off for Dodd. He realized this wasn't just about bad banking practices anymore. This hinted at something much bigger, much more calculated.
This was a turning point for Dodd. It made him deeply skeptical of concentrated power and the potential for corruption.
So he leaves the banking world behind. And that's how he ends up on this path that leads him to investigate those powerful tax-exempt foundations.
And with his background in finance, his understanding of how systems could be manipulated, he was uniquely positioned to lead that investigation.
So we've got Dodd, right, former banker, now this investigator, digging into the world of these tax-exempt foundations. And remember, it's the 1950s, the Red Scare. Everyone's suspicious of communist influence.
A time of intense ideological struggle, you could say. And the Reese Committee, they were operating under this assumption that communist sympathizers, they might be trying to undermine America from within. And these foundations, well, they could be the perfect vehicle for that.
Exactly. Funnel money, influence policy, you name it. And Dodd, based on his investigation, he starts to believe he's found evidence of something even wilder.
Right.
A deliberate attempt to, get this, steer American education away from his core principles. Individual liberty, limited government, that whole thing.
Now, this is where Dodd's claims get really interesting. He wasn't just talking about, like, biased textbooks or a couple of radical professors. He believed these foundations, they were in it for the long haul, trying to fundamentally change how Americans thought about their own country.
And the biggest player in all of this, according to Dodd, the Ford Foundation, the big one. In his 1982 interview, he talks about this meeting he had with Rowan Gaither, the president of the Ford Foundation at the time.
Yeah.
And this meeting, if Dodd's telling it straight, is where things take a really strange turn.
Yeah, this encounter, it's crucial. It's like trying to peek behind the curtain and see the wizard pulling the levers.
Okay, so picture this. Dodd's sitting across from the head honcho of one of the most influential philanthropic organizations, right? And Gaither, completely out of the blue, allegedly tells him that the Ford Foundation, along with other major foundations, were working under directives to, and I quote, use our grant-making power so as to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union.
Hold on, let that sink in for a second. They're talking about using massive amounts of money to subtly shift American society towards the ideology of their biggest rival in the Cold War.
Yeah, it's like something out of a spy movie, right?
Yeah.
No, I have to be upfront here. There's no independent confirmation of this meeting or what Gaither supposedly said. It's Dodd's word against, well, history.
Exactly, got to keep that in mind. Healthy skepticism, always. But even if we just entertain the possibility that Dodd's being truthful, it opens up a whole can of worms.
Yeah.
Like, who issued those directives? What were they hoping to achieve? And how in the world did they think they could pull it off through philanthropic work?
So many questions. And it wasn't just the Ford Foundation. Dodd also talked about how someone on his team, a lawyer named Catherine Casey, she was going through the minutes of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, another one of those big players.
Yeah, the Carnegie Endowment, huge influence on education, especially internationally. They were all about promoting peace, supposedly.
Right, peaceful solutions. But according to Dodd, what Casey found in those minutes, it told a very different story. He said those minutes showed that the Carnegie Endowment actually talked about how war, actual war, could be used as a tool to reshape society. They'd even actively worked to get the U.S. involved in World War I.
Now that's a bombshell. The way history is usually taught, America getting involved in World War I, it was complicated. German aggression, the sinking of the Lusitania, all that. Dodd's saying there was this whole other agenda at play, something way more calculated, almost Machiavellian.
Right, like pulling strings from the shadows.
Yeah.
And it gets even crazier. Dodd claims that after World War I, the Carnegie Endowment, they got worried that the U.S. would just retreat back into isolationism. So they switched tactics and decided to focus on what else? Controlling American education.
So now we're not just talking about messing with foreign policy. It's about shaping how Americans think, how they see the world.
And Dodd didn't stop there. He claimed the Carnegie Endowment teamed up with the Rockefeller Foundation, another giant in the philanthropy world, like a divide-and-conquer strategy.
Yeah.
Carnegie would handle domestic education. Rockefeller would take on the international scene.
Wow. Imagine these organizations with all their money and influence working together to mold the minds of entire generations. Kind of creepy when you think about it.
Dodd said they even rewrote American history. He mentioned this huge 7-volume study of American history funded by the Carnegie Endowment. And guess what? According to him, the last volume concluded that America's destiny was, and I quote, collectivism, administered with characteristic American efficiency.
Collectivism. That's code for putting group interests ahead of individual ones. Socialism, communism, that kind of thing. Totally at odds with the whole American ideal of individual liberty, right?
Mm-hmm.
If Dodd's interpretation is accurate, it means they were trying to push America away from its own founding principles.
And how are they going to pull that off? Well, Dodd said the Carnegie Endowment was instrumental in setting up the American Historical Association, the AHA. Ever heard of
Are
it?
you kidding? The AHA, they're like the authority on history. They publish journals, set standards for research, influence how history's taught at every level.
Exactly. So Dodd's saying they weren't just rewriting history, they were controlling the whole narrative. Now, whether you believe Dodd or not, you got to admit, this is some mind-blowing stuff. Makes you wonder who's really in charge,
It definitely makes you question the influence of these powerful organizations. What are they really up to? And how much of our world is shaped by forces we don't even see?
Right. It's a lot to take in. And speaking of things that are a lot to take in, the Reese Committee's investigation, it took this sudden dramatic turn that kept Dodd from sharing his findings with Congress. Talk about a cliffhanger. So, just as Dodd's team, they're about to go public with everything they found, bam, roadblocks everywhere.
It's like hitting a brick wall, or maybe even a coordinated effort to shut down the investigation before it could really make waves.
And get this, Dodd claims one of the groups putting on the pressure was, are you ready for this? The Republican National Committee, the RNC.
No, that is interesting. You'd think the RNC would be, sympathetic to Dodd's concerns about potential communist influence.
Exactly. Makes you wonder, what's going on here? Why would they try to discredit their own guy?
It shows you how effective even baseless accusations can be. The mere suggestion of something like anti-Semitism, it could taint the whole investigation, make people question everything.
And the opposition didn't stop there. Remember Congressman Wayne Hayes from the committee? The one who initially backed the investigation?
Yeah, what happened with him?
Well, according to Dodd, Hayes did a complete 180, turned against the committee, and basically single-handedly shut the whole thing down.
Wow. So much for government oversight, right? It makes you wonder if he was pressured, maybe by someone higher up, to sabotage the investigation.
Right. It's like something out of House of Cards. You can almost picture those backroom deals going down. So what are we supposed to make of all this? We've got this incredible story, evidence that seems to support at least some of it, and then bam, the investigation gets shut down.
It's a mess, right? It's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction at this point. But even if we take Dodd's claims with a grain of salt, they raise some really important questions about power, influence, and who's really shaping our world.
Exactly. It's like how much of what we believe is actually true and how much is influenced by forces we don't even realize are at play.
And those questions aren't limited to tax-exempt foundations either. We're talking about any powerful institution, whether it's a corporation, a government agency, or even a media outlet. Who benefits from the status quo? Who loses? Whose voices are being amplified and whose are being silenced?
It's enough to make your head spin, right? But it's also incredibly important to think about this stuff, to be aware of the forces that shape our world, even the ones we can't see.
Because if we're not paying attention, we're just pawns in someone else's game, and that's the game I don't want to play.
Me neither. Well, that's our deep dive into the world of Norman Dodd and his investigation of tax-exempt foundations. What do you think? What stood out to you? What will you be looking into further? This is one of those stories that stays with you long after the credits roll. Thanks for joining us, and remember, sometimes the most important discoveries are the questions, not the answers.